Hey guys, today I'm going to be reading Chapter 3 of My Dog Skip by Willie Morris. If you haven't read Chapter 2 or 1 yet, I'll link in the description, or you can go check it out on my channel. I created a little playlist, and I'll be adding this there too. So yeah, let's get started. Chapter 3, The Woods, Fishing, and a Skunk. One autumn afternoon, my father had old Skip out for squirrels at the delta end of the county. There was a slight rustling in the underbrush. Skip suddenly froze, sniffed the air, looked intently around, then with a neat bounding leap crashed in after the sound. Almost as suddenly he emerged, with the most woebegone dog in the world, a skunk, his dignity intact, shredded royally out into the open and down the trail. Skip had the foul yellow liquid all over him, and smelled so purid we had put handkerchiefs on our noses. Even his eyes looked sick. I can still smell the malevolent odor, which had the wretched texture of spoiled molasses and 1,000 burnt wires. We walked back to the clearing and wrapped him in an old blanket and took him to our backyard as far away from the house as we could get, and bathed him, not once, but twice, in tomato juice, the oldest remedy in town for skunk smells. We did not want to lay our eyes on him for days, and until the odor began to wear off, he was the most listless and unenthusiastic creature I ever saw. About 4 or 5 days later, we were sitting in the front room listening to President Roosevelt on the radio. Skip had not been allowed in the house since the assault of the skunk. But now he opened the screen door with his nose and entered. He still smelled bad. My brother was furious. He knocked down an armchair and ran through my father's legs. When we finally caught him, we gave him another tomato juice bath. Our first dogs were the big ones, Tony, Sam, Jimbo, and since they were bird dogs, they had a fine and natural inclination to hunt. Yet Skip was the best of all, for he trampled the woods with an inborn sense of possibility and adventure. The Delta woods, when I was a boy, were a living thing for me, and Skip, since his earliest days in them, loved their commanding excitement and mystery. There were stretches in the dank swamp bottom. They stayed almost woolly dark, even on brightest of days. The tall, thick trees were covered with vines and creeping plants, and on a gray December afternoon, the silence was so cold and impenetrable that a very small boy would become frightened and stay close to my father. He taught me how to note landmarks the deeper we went into the woods. One hickory and a garnered limb, like a broken arm, or the ash next to it, was split in two, probably by lightning. Sometimes he would make his own marks with powder or empty shotgun shells, and he would keep an eye close to his compass. 3 or 4 times in my memory, men had gotten hopelessly lost in these hidden places, and someone would have to organize search parties or get the sheriff and his deputies to circle around and round the woods looking for footprints or empty shells or a sign of fires. As we walked along the thin trail, fighting the mosquitoes that swarmed us despite the ointment we slathered on our skin, the sun suddenly opened up some half clearing, and giant spider webs would shimmer and toss in the light. Daddy would stand dead in his tracks, gesturing me to be absolutely still, and he would point to a deer farther down the path, looking at us brief instant before scampering away into the trees. We never hunted deer. My father was against it, and mainly we came to the woods to shoot the wild squirrels, gray and red, and sometimes black. The squirrel dumplings my mother would make in her new pressure cooker, even if we had to spit out the buckshot while eating them, were always worth the hardest day's walk. We had squirrel cookouts in our backyard and invited all my friends. One night, Heejee ate 4 fried squirrels by himself, and Skip could eat 2 with the blink of an eye, and invariably asked for more. Many was Many was the time we would rise before dawn, and Skip would be waiting for us at the car, such with his agitation to get started toward the woods. We would drive down the flat roads, past the dead cotton stalks in the fields, making it to the woods just as the sun was beginning to show. Then we would catch the chatter and rustling of all the birds and beasts, and when we got in and see what was there, and once to tear a muscle to get in and see what was there, and once in there, would almost immediately start pointing squirrels. In the bottoms, the ground was so soggy that our boots would make faint oozing sounds, and our footmarks would slowly lift up the water as we walked. Skip's paw prints would make the same funny sounds until he got used to them and would sometimes scratch them to see if there might be any sinister underneath. And there were days when the air would be so thick with mosquitoes in that raw wilderness setting upon us in vast and palpable waves that we had to try to find someplace else or give up and go home. I envied Skip his fur coat, and when the mosquitoes were troublesome for him, mosquitoes were neither here nor there, and we would have to beg him to depart with us. Such was his affinity for those woods. These woods were so much a part of our lives. My father's and Skip's and mine, only half hour's drives or so from town, that I grew up taking them for granted. Only later did I realize that they would be the last and largest of the Green Delta forests, that it would be at the bottom of the lower triangle of the Delta. Where we were, the remnants of primordial wilderness had left untouched in incursions of man. It was to this spectral country, but closer to the Mississippi River, as I would read many years later in Delta Autumn, and that William Faulkner's character, Uncle Ike McCallison, came on his last hunt, having to drive 200 miles from Jefferson when once it had been 30. Little wonder that as I grew older, I always in my memory associated these woods with boyhood and old Skip. My father and I were in one of these places on December 7th, 1941, when I was 7, sometime before I got Skip, I can remember the day by the news had greeted us when we went home, and we had been there many times before then. First, I used a .22, though Daddy once let me shoot his 12 gauge out of nothing but maliciousness, because after I squeezed the trigger, that gun knocked me for a twisting nosedive into the mud. On my 12th birthday, I got a shiny new 16 gauge, smelling richly of oil, and the next time we went into the woods, I wasted a whole box of shells out of sheer exuberance, and Skip thought I had gone insane. One afternoon, we were walking through a stretch of swamp bottom with Owen McGinty, when one of the town firemen, all of a sudden, Owen shouted, "Jump!" Just as my foot hit something soft and wet, I jumped with all the enthusiasm I could muster. "Look at that," Owen said, rolling out the that. My father went, "Woo!" There was a rattlesnake that must have been 8 feet long right in my path. Even Skip, interrupt in all things, but young at the time, was intimidated by the sight of this menacing serpent, and he backed off a few feet and merely stared at it. "Let the boy shoot him," Owen said, and I aimed my new shotgun and killed him right through the head. Owen pulled out his knife and cut off his rattlers and handed them to me. The next day I took the rattlers to school, and my classmates gathered around and said he was a big un. But Miss Abbott, my teacher, found out about it and made me take my trophy home. "If the dust from the insides got in your eyes," she said, "you could be blinded for life." My father and Miss Abbott got that from the old wives' tale. Several times in the woods, around Panther Creek, we ran across a man my father knew, a hanger-on, he called him. The man lived right in the middle of the woods in a little crooked shanty he had made for himself. He had a scraggly black beard and wore beat-up khakis and a slouch hat. And in back of his shack was a vegetable garden. The game warden ignored him, and he lived off the animals he could kill, and made money now and then guiding the deer hunters. My father later told me that the man would eat anything, just so it wasn't alive, and even then he might eat it if the gravy was good. Skip took to this man right away, perhaps because the old fellow gave him fried squirrel and allowed him to tease the numerous squawking chickens. "I'll give you $5 for that dog," he said to me one day. I refused, replying, and although Skip had a lot of the woods in him, he was mainly a town dog. Later, when I lived in England, I saw places that the English called woods, but compared it with the delta swamp bottoms of the boyhood time that they could have been grown in a shop of a florist. Similarly, the lakes where my father, Skip, and I went to fish, compared with the man-made lakes I would see later in central Texas, were real lakes, of a piece with a stark, heavy earth that enveloped them. Their waters were murky and oppressive, and the worst death I ever heard about took place at one of them. When a water skier got tangled in the school of water moccasins. We did cane pole fishing, both to save money and because it was lazier, for we seldom exerted ourselves on these trips to Wolf Lake or Blue Lake or 5 Mile. The most work came the night before, when we hired a couple children at a quarter an hour and went back to town to catch the roaches of our bait. Directly across the dirt road was a black juke joint, and the sorrowful sounds of blues music wafted across the way as we proceeded on our errant's odyssey. We had a big wire basket with a lid on top, and we would spot the roaches with our flashlights, trap them in our gloves, and drop them into this basket. Need it to be said, though this may shock some modern-day hygiene-conscious readers, that Skip was also an agile retriever of roaches, and likewise that he enjoyed going to the dump for this pungent smells and strange discarded paraphernalia and debris. The next morning, very early, we would drive out into the same delta country, only not so far, rent a boat from the sharecropper, and spend a day drifting around the water. The fishing itself bored old Skip, in marked contrast with the exuberant hunting in the forest. My father would sit at one end of the boat, I at the other, and Skip in the middle, and after a decent while he would stretch out on his back with his paws extended upward and dozed in the indolent sunshine. I guess he really just wanted to be with us. In the quiet intervals, I would ask him, "Want to take a swim, Skip?" And he would rouse himself from his slumbers, shake himself 3 or 4 times, and get the kinks out, and jump overboard, paddling around with only his nose and top part of his head above the water. And when he had enough, he would swim back to the boat, and I would bend down and lift him in. When the biting was good, we might bring home 20 or 30 white perch, or beam, or googly eye. When it was slow, we would follow Skip's example and go to sleep in the boat. Whenever we caught a small fish, my father would say, "Throw him back. Only the country folks take the little ones and eat 'em, bones and all." We would stop at some crossroads store on the way back to town and stretch and have a knee-high strawberry or an orange crush, and talk about the fishing with the old man who sat out front whittling and chewing brown mule, spitting between the cracks of the parched floor, and talking all the while. I would get Skip a bag of potato chips, and the 3 of us, a man, a boy, and a dog, would idly sit on the porch and absorb the and absorb the littling prattle of the old men and gaze out the black people picking cotton in the fields beyond. When we got home, my father and I would clean the fish on the back steps and eat them fried, with a crust as delicious as the fish itself. Skip himself had some fried goggle eyes, but you could have taken the bones out. But you would have to take the bones out for him first. I remember one of these afternoons, one of the last, because by the time I was 16, which meant Skip had turned 6, I just about lost interest, and then my father and Skip would go out alone. But on this spring day, the weather had taken turns between sunshine and the light rain, and we caught more fish than we ever caught before. I barely had time to get the line into the water before I could feel the pulling and tugging, and out would come a fish big enough for a feast. The gars were jumping and making splashes all over the lake, and the turtles were diving off their logs. The fish kept biting away. Clearly, something was going on under there. One day, such as this, Skip would not be permitted his swim, but I could tell him he knew that something auspicious was going on. Then the wind rose, the rain came down in heavy drops, and we paddled to land as quickly as we could and made it to the deserted tent shack just in time. The drops made little clouds in the dust until the dust itself was wet and muddy, and the rain blew in gusts and rattled hard on the rusty tin roof. We waited there for a long time until the rain suddenly stopped. Then the sun came out again, and the whole world was wet and cool, the trees heavy and glistening in the sun, and the rich delta land humming and making its grand noises, the soft fluttering of leaves and cries of birds, the rush of the water. Why do I remember so well the sight of old Skip in that moment long ago, sitting on his haunches at the edge of the doorway, gazing out, transfixed by the Lord's good earth? Then Daddy said, "We better be getting back. If there's any fish left, we'll get 'em alone to grow. We'll let 'em grow." And that is it for chapter 3. That was a very long and confusing chapter, but I hope you guys enjoyed. Give this video a like, subscribe down below, and stay tuned for chapter 4. Bye!